16 of Give Me Liberty. This covers America's Gilded Age, which is from 1870 to 1890. Some of the big questions from this time period are, what is freedom? What are the conditions necessary to reach it? And how involved should the government be in securing these rights? So right after the fall of Reconstruction, these questions are still coming up. They're changing because there's no more occupation of the South. And there's this confusion sort of how to move forward without any framework that they can look at directly. One of the symbols during this time was the Statue of Liberty, which opened in 1886. And it was given to the United States by a Frenchman named Edward de la Boyer. I apologize, I don't speak French, but you can get the idea here. And this was given to the United States in response to Lincoln's assassination. And the photo you see at the right here is the Statue of Liberty in Paris before it was sent to the United States. And this represents this idea that there was this hope that the United States would be a bastion for freedom, and that having outlawed slavery and attempting to move forward and maintaining their status as a united front, that they would be able to represent this sort of freedom to the world. These are still issues that we think and talk about in great detail today. Again, these weren't new issues then, and they're ones that continue to come up now. So it's just a different iteration of the same sort of question and an evolution of the way in which people saw their rights. Part of this has to do with the Second Industrial Revolution. So the first one is generally seen as between the decades of the 1760s and the 1840s in Europe and the United States. And the biggest focus was on natural resources, labor, and at this point, manufacturing, the capital to support it, railroads, canals, mining, etc. The armed forces were actually in charge of removing Native Americans in the West to make room for this expansion. So this had been an ongoing activity of the government as well, and we'll talk about it in greater detail coming up in this lecture. By 1913, 1/3 of the industrial output in the world was from the United States, meaning that 2/3 of American workers worked for wages by 1890. And this meant that there were a lot of people working in factories, which was a big change from what had come before. So there's less and less subsistence farming, the small family farms to get by, and more people working for money to then buy the things that they needed. And this changes pretty much everything if you think about it. People leaving the home to go to work and taking back money instead of needing to rely on making their own goods. So in some ways, some things became easier, and in other ways, they became much more unreliable. From 1870 to 1920, 11 million people moved from farmland into cities. So they moved off small family farms into the cities to work for wages. And 25 million immigrants came to the United States during that same time. So many people coming from elsewhere and attempting to make it in the United States. Railroads were a huge part of this Industrial Revolution. The railroad system used both private and governmental input financially and otherwise. And from 1860 to 1880, the amount of track actually tripled. By 1920, it had tripled again. So part of this had to do with wanting to transport things quickly during the Civil War, and then afterwards there was a lot of repair and then continuation. there was a new national market that didn't exist prior to this in any sustainable form, because there wasn't a quick way to transport goods from far away. So now it was possible to send goods from the west to the east, which is where the center of consumption was at the time, and they would be able to transport perishable goods that wouldn't be bad by the time they got there. So this opened up a whole network of dependence, essentially, or symbiotic relationship between the East and the West, with the West providing the East with food, essentially. By 1883, time zones were actually established for the ease of train scheduling and for business purposes. So before this point, people had their own local times. This may be hard for you to imagine if you haven't thought about it, but it would just change by the sun, the position of the sun, and change by the way people had their clocks set in town, essentially. So it was not a regulated thing before. And time zones were established so that people knew exactly what time a train was supposed to pull up, and they'd know when they were supposed to be there to pick up people or to unload goods, that sort of thing. There's a really great book written about this called Grand Central, and if you're interested, you should be able to find it with just that information. And I do suggest reading it. It's really fascinating to understand why things that we take for granted are how they are, because they're typically not just something that was standard. They're something that someone had to think up to fix a problem. And with the perfection of the railroad over time, you also see the mass market, and eventually department stores are even possible because of this. So there's this ability to make more of the same thing and have them just ready-made, and have clothing, for example, ready-made on the rack for people to buy. And if they're able to ship it all over the place, they're able to have a manufacturing plant in one place and move things quickly to other stores around the nation. You have a map here of the major railroads in 1880, and then the time zone boundaries. And the time zone boundaries are still the ones that we use today. We haven't changed them. And they were, again, established because of the railroads. So these two things are inextricably intertwined with one another. But you can see how much track was laid in a relatively short amount of time. And then this tripled again over the next couple decades. Innovation was a huge part of the Gilded Age. So the Atlantic cable was this monumental achievement in 1866 that allowed people to communicate nearly instantaneously via telegraph from the United States to Europe. I've included a small clip, a PBS clip on the transatlantic cable for you to watch. And it really was a feat of engineering. It's sort of mind-blowing with the limited technology as we perceive it, that they were able to complete this and that it actually worked. Among the other inventions of this time frame, you have the telephone, which is obviously groundbreakingly important. And we've seen so many iterations of this since then. And we're now at the point where we have tiny computers in our pockets that we also use as telephones. And increasingly, people are using them less as telephones and simply as digital communication devices. And the typewriter also came up at this point. And that was huge so that people could more quickly write what they wanted to without having to worry about handwriting things and the expense that takes on in itself. And the handheld camera was also created at this point. Of course, it's nothing like what we had now, but you start to see people able to take photographs that weren't needing the entire tripod set up in this for people to sit still for long periods of time. Of course, they still did have to stay still for a relatively long amount of time compared to what we have now, but things were increasingly getting better and better, and things were moving much faster. There was more instant gratification in this time frame. And electricity is one of the most notable changes in people's lives. You had the Chicago World's Fair in 1893 that people were just completely fascinated by the electrical display that they had there. This changed the way people lived. People were more easily able to do things after dark. They were able to use manufacturing equipment more efficiently. There were so many upgrades that we can think of that we tend even not to think of. I mean, you're watching this partly because electricity exists, and that's the most basic function that you can think of when it comes to watching this on the computer. So really, these are groundbreaking innovations that happened during this time frame, and there was so much money floating around. It was easier to find funding for these sorts of creations. There were economic concerns, even though there was so much money flying around. With all this development, there was fierce competition, but the world economy suffered on a large scale, and partly due to this competition, people were having cutthroat matches with one another. People also started to create trusts to get around these laws. Trusts are defined as legal devices whereby the affairs of several rival companies were managed by a single director. And what this essentially means is people would create a monopoly. So they would combine several businesses without technically combining them, just having them all fall under the same umbrella, and one person or one entity would be operating all of those, with the idea that they wouldn't be hurting the other companies. So they were essentially fixing the market for themselves by controlling these large companies. And some examples of these are U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, and International Harvester. These are some of the biggest companies at the time. What this brings up is this idea of people being either robber barons or captains of industry. It's unclear to many people whether these wealthy men were on the scale between robber baron and captain of industry. Generally depends on someone's own place in society how they categorize many of these men. And it was almost invariably men who controlled these large businesses at the time, because the gender roles were still such that women were mostly to stay home. Or if they did go to work, they certainly didn't have positions of importance for the most part. So, like anything, you could think that people are on a spectrum. There's hardly any straightforward good or evil. Mostly everybody's something in between. And some of this in between, you can look at Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, and they're both known for their philanthropy, even if sometimes it was actually misguided philanthropy. And simultaneously, they were known for their tyrannical behavior towards their workers. So they're both known as dictators and saviors, and sometimes people ignore one part of them in favor of exaggerating the other part, when the reality is they fall somewhere in between, whether they fall towards the good side or towards the bad side. They're still somewhere relatively in between. And there are a couple of concepts that come up here with the idea of creating these master companies that then hold an umbrella over several different things. We have vertical integration, which is defined as control of every phase of the business, from raw materials to transport, manufacturing, and distribution. What that means is they controlled everything that went into their product. So they controlled the raw materials. For example, if we're talking about steel, they would control the iron mines, they would control the mining operations, and they would control parts of the railroad that would move that from the west to the east where it would be processed. They would own the manufacturing plants, and they would own the distribution apparatus. So they would have their own way of getting it out to customers. Horizontal expansion, on the other hand, refers to buying out the competitors in the same business. So it would be taking the same businesses essentially and just combining them all into the one that had the most money and was going to take over. And you can see on the left here, if you're more curious about horizontal versus vertical integration, there's an explanation of it here for you with a little infographic. Workers' rights at this point really continued to suffer as they always had. Some things were expanding, but things were generally still relatively miserable for those on the bottom. Very few workers who worked the majority of the factory jobs actually saw expanded rights and higher wages. Some of the skilled workers did indeed see a jump in their wages, but most people didn't. And most of the people within these factory jobs were men. We did see some women able to break into these jobs, but they were paid even less than the bottom men who were employed in the same position. Unions were actually starting to become quite strong at this point, and they were concerned with protecting the workers' rights against the owners of the company. So they were standing up for wages, they were standing up for the amount of time that was necessary for somebody to work, they were standing up for people if they were injured on the job. There weren't all of these laws that we're used to today. Those came about mostly because of unions requiring that these laws be changed and lobbying for them to be changed. From 1880 to 1900, around 35 people died per year in factory and mining incidents. This was the highest rate in the industrial world. So there was a lot to complain about. There were a lot of danger that you would find working in the factory or in the mine. The mine was especially dangerous, but we know of incidents of both. And this is a lot of people per year, which then created large protests around the safety of these workers. By 1890, the richest 1% had the same total income as the bottom half. So the bottom 50% and the richest 1% had the same income. And the richest 1% owned more property than the remaining 99%. So they owned more property, rented it out to people, had huge swaths of land that were huge farms and factories and the mines and railroads. So most of the land was owned by the ultra wealthy. Jacob Riis is famous for having written How the Other Half Lives in 1890. This included photos and explanations of extreme poverty. The photograph to the right of the men sitting up on the high beam is one of the many from that book, and it's one of the more tame ones from that book, actually. If It should be readily available for you to read. I'm sure it's actually free through the library, not only in print form, but probably also in digital form. And you can see all these pictures of the way people were living, and most of them were working overtime every week, but still living in poverty, or people who were injured on the job and then had nothing to back them up. There was no safety net for those who were injured, and there were no laws protecting that worker and protecting their job. The West at this point was really starting to become more developed. So farms had been moving out towards the West for a few decades. And at this point, they were starting to look at building cities to house all of the workers who were going out to work in the mines and going out to work on these large farms, but mostly on the mines, and to support the railroad system and to support the movement of agricultural goods from the West to the East Coast. So post-Civil War, there were still about 250,000 Native Americans living beyond white American settlements to the West. Government involvement in the settling of the West with the Native American removal forces and treaties struck up to convince them to move on their own were pretty harsh. The government was also involved in selling or giving away plots of land to convince European-descended farmers to move further out. So the removal forces sometimes meant killing people directly, and it sometimes meant sentencing them to live within these concentration camps that they called reservations. We can call them concentration camps because people were forced to go into them, were hidden behind barbed wire in many of them, and oftentimes were told that they would face bodily harm or death should they decide to leave. So it's not as if they were granted pieces of property that then they were allowed to do whatever they wanted on, and they were allowed to come out of whenever they wanted. Many of the situations were actually much like concentration camps, and quite violent and oppressive. The land that was taken over after Native Americans were removed was also sold and distributed to the railroads and mining companies. So the mining industry had completely taken off, and in order to transport those goods back to the east, you needed to expand the railroad system. And the railroads had an infinite amount of money from rich investors and from the government as well. There was still a large Mormon and Latino population in the West as well, and it was because it was still deemed to be some level of freedom outside of the East Coast culture within the West. There was less oversight, there was more perceived opportunity to the West. Some terms that come out of this region and time frame are rugged individualism and sturdy independence. So these call to mind being able to pick yourself up by your bootstraps, to be able to go out and go hunting, to be able to take care of yourself, essentially, and to live a tough life with less amenities than you would find in the eastern states. Farming and agriculture were still a huge part of how the West functioned. Eventually, the railroad made it possible to send these items over long distances to the eastern cities and then on to Europe as well. Cultivation of the land in the West was popular in a way that it hadn't been before because of advances in equipment. So people were able to move through their crops more quickly, meaning that they could expand the amount that they were taking in and the amount that they were planting. The Homestead Act was a huge point of a huge turning point. The government essentially gave land grants to farmers so that they could move to the West and produce things like corn and wheat. Monocrops were particularly popular because you could get a lot from the same person And if you were making a field and had the space that was good for growing corn, you should just grow a bunch of corn, essentially. And women were responsible for many of the home chores as well as farm chores. It was a really tough life for many women and men alike, especially if they didn't have a lot of money. There were not those sort of comforts that they had in the East, which is part of the reason the government decided to give away land to a lot of people to entice them to move out, because it wasn't going to be an easy life for them. Part of what increased the farming activity as well was this newfound access to irrigation and irrigation methods, and understanding how to more effectively move water onto your crops, essentially. There was also the creation of chemicals that would help your plants grow more quickly, and you could yield better rates, essentially. You could take in more goods and sell them for more money in a shorter amount of time. So people began to use all sorts of chemicals and get away from the original organic farming that they were using. And machinery improvements were also key to this. So you start to have different iterations of engines and people being able to expand the amount of territory that they need to go over, because they weren't necessarily needing to use horses for everything. The idea of the cowboy is particularly popular when you talk about the West. There weren't that many cowboys to begin with. Most people living in the West at this point were farmers or involved in a farm life somehow, or they were Native Americans, and they weren't necessarily cowboys. But it is this romantic, popular idea of what the West was. Cowboys were known for their long cattle drives, especially from Texas, and they were usually white, but also sometimes Mexican and African American, and they were involved in this lifestyle, and they were paid relatively low wages to move cows from one locale to another. And eventually, in the 1880s, fencing off property led to a decline in the need for cowboys and moving animals over vast distances. So people had their own dedicated grazing areas. So there wasn't this popularized idea of every man who moved out west became a cowboy. It was specific people, and it was a really rough life for which they weren't being well paid. Another set of people who were moving to the West at this time were the Chinese. And many Chinese immigrants, most of them at first were young and single men, came during the gold rush in California. By the 1870s, by the time we're talking about in the Gilded Age, families were coming across the Pacific rather than single men alone. So people were looking to settle here and not just find work to send money home and then eventually return home. By 1880, there were over 100,000 Chinese immigrants in the United States. 3/4 of that population was in California. You can still see the historical markers of this movement in cities like San Francisco, especially. Places have entire Chinatowns where people were moving in and trying to find housing and trying to find work. And most of the Chinese workers were employed in mining, railroad building, or domestic work. And they often accepted lower wages than what white workers were willing to accept. So many of the European descended workers were upset with the Chinese workers because they felt like they were being outbid, essentially. The Mormons in the West, there had been a large population of them since the 1840s, and they had moved out to the West because there was a conflict based on moral ideas between many in the United States and the Mormons, and some of this centered around the concept of polygamy and the strong connection between the church and state. Those were both deemed to be anti-American. And so many people were run out of other states and moved further and further west. Brigham Young, who was the leader of the Mormons, was removed by James Buchanan as the governor of Utah Territory, and troops were sent in until the Civil War. So U.S. troops were sent into the Utah Territory to make sure that the Mormons were conforming with U.S. laws. And during the Civil War, the troops were pulled out to fight in the Civil War. By the 1880s, the Mormons had banned polygamy in order to attempt to assimilate better into the white American way, the European American way. They outlawed polygamy legally, but some people within the religion still practice it today, and some people continued to practice it at that time. But those who wanted to be a part of the larger society dropped that. The Native Americans, there are many different tribes, many different groups, many different bands who were living in the West until they were mostly killed or pushed off their own land and concentrated. If you took U.S. History 1, you would have been talking about this that whole semester as well. And we'll continue to talk about it throughout this whole semester. So the Transcontinental Railroad brought many new settlers into the West and pushed more and more Native Americans out of their homeland. The changes in technology had been really drastic for the way of life that the Plains Indians had experienced. And having access to different technologies and different ways of getting about and different ways of finding food and making food led to changes in the culture. And there was a sort of doing away with some of the traditional Native American ways of living. So there'd always been this hunting on a large scale, and if the weaponry got better, that meant people could take more creatures at one time, which would mean a decline in the population. There was a pretty large disruption in the way that people were living, essentially, and especially for Native Americans. From the 1850s forward, there was an increased amount of conflict over the encroaching nature of the settlers. They weren't just passing through anymore. So now, when people were coming, they were hoping to settle, and people began fighting back. So many of the Native Americans had fought back the entire time and had tried to stand their ground and not let people move in, but that failed most of the time because they didn't have the same amount of resources that the American troops had. In 1869, the Ulysses S. Grant started a peace policy under which many villages and buffalo were destroyed in order to undermine the American way of life. So they thought if they could do things to disrupt the Native American way of life, they'd be able to convince them to assimilate or face death, essentially, if they were not going to be able to do what they had done for centuries. Quanah Parker is a famous Comanche leader, he's pictured here at the left, who led a revolt against white encroachment in Texas in the 1870s. There's a really well-written book about this called Empire of the Summer Moon, and I definitely suggest you check it out if you're interested in Native American history. But he is one of the more famous warriors of the Comanche tribe who fought back against U.S. encroachment. Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce are also quite well known from Native American history. The Nez Perce were actually attempting to go to Canada in the late 1870s, but were forcibly removed to Oklahoma instead by the former chief of the Freedmen's Bureau. Chief Joseph gave a speech in Washington, D.C., and the audience included Rutherford B. Hayes, the president, condemning the confinement of Native Americans and saying they had the right to be free men. He's quoted as saying, "I have heard talk and talk, but nothing is done. Good words do not last long unless they amount to something. Words do not pay for my dead people. They do not pay for my country, now overrun by white men. When I think of our condition, my heart is heavy. I see men of my race treated as outlaws and driven from country to country, or shot down like animals. I know that my race must change. We cannot hold our own with white men as we are. We only ask an even chance to live as other men live." So he's essentially saying he acknowledges that there needs to be some level of assimilation, otherwise it would be extermination. And he's acknowledging that they don't have the resources to stand up to the American soldiers who were coming in. And he's just asking that they be considered equal citizens if this is what they have to submit to. Obviously, this doesn't happen for quite some time, and we'll keep going on about this throughout the semester and actually throughout this lecture. So there was notable Native American resistance and defeat. So the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876 was a huge success for the Sioux and Cheyenne, who were led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. They initially killed around 250 U.S. soldiers, including General George Custer. It was famously Custer's Last Stand, if you've heard of that. But this is where he went down, and this was a huge win for Native Americans. By 1871, the treaty system, so before the Battle of Little Bighorn, the treaty system had been abolished, and an elimination or genocide campaign had gone forward with the intent to assimilate or eliminate. People use this because it rhymes and it's easy to remember, but the reality of it is that they were told that they either needed to submit to this American way of life or they would die, essentially. Part of the assimilation campaign were boarding schools for Native American children. And this continued well into the 20th century, actually. They were brought to these schools where they would learn white culture, wear white clothing, and only speak English. You can see a short PBS documentary on Native American boarding schools that I'll have posted for you if you want to know more about this subject. There are many traumatic stories that come out of this system. Young boys arriving at the schools to have their braids cut off, their traditional braids, and being told that they were not allowed to speak unless they were speaking English, which many of them did not know any English at that point. So you can imagine being taken away from your family and told to completely change your identity in order to fit in. The Dawes Act of 1887, which was named for Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts, broke up the tribal lands into smaller plots that were then distributed to Native American families and also to white purchasers. So assimilation meant citizenship for many, but it also meant giving up on the way of life and the cultural history that many treasured. In response to this, there were continued protests. One form of protest was the ghost dance. It's a form of religious revitalization among many Native American tribes, and notably in the tribes found in the Black Hills, the Sioux. And it was a pan-Indian movement in that there were many tribes and groups involved. There's a short Hollywood depiction of the ghost dance that you can see from the HBO series Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And the hope was that the white man would disappear, the buffalo would return, and the Native American way of life would once again take hold. In 1890, in December of 1890, white soldiers opened fire on some of these ghost dancers at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. They killed upwards of 200, mostly women and children, some men. For this massacre, the U.S. soldiers were actually awarded the Medal of Honor. And I've included a clip about the Wounded Knee Massacre here for you, but it's quite famous. It's probably one of the more notable massacres that you will hear taking place, and it's sort of one of the last big ones that took place, which is why it's a marker. And this convinced many people to essentially surrender and come under U.S. Ways of being. So they went towards the assimilate route after they saw women and children just shot down in such large numbers. By 1900, there were only about 250,000 Native Americans left within the United States. Of those, 53,000 were U.S. citizens for having assimilated and agreeing to live this white U.S. way of being, and another 100,000 got citizenship in the Oklahoma Territory, and more received citizenship in 1919 for having fought in World War I. So having fought for the country, they were awarded citizenship. And the remainder were incorporated in 1924 when the federal government said that Native Americans did indeed have citizenship. They were able to vote at that point and able to participate in the government of the United States. So the idea of cowboys and Indians out west, while there are some grains of truth to this, there's a lot of fiction that has been put forth by the Hollywood narrative that people cling to. The West, at this point in time, was considered a settler society. So what this means is that immigrants took over the original inhabitants. So Native Americans were the original inhabitants, and the European Americans moving from east to west were these new settlers that took over the space. The United States as a whole is actually considered a settler society because it was full of Native Americans prior to European Americans arriving, or just Europeans at that time. And Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and Argentina are some other examples of this phenomenon of settler society where the original inhabitants are pushed out and immigrants then take over. The imagined nature of the West is that there was independence, opportunity, and the wild, lawless West of the film industry. Well, some grains of this are indeed true. Many people who lived there were either being forcibly removed or they were farmers and not the type that was typically glorified on film. So we have this popularization of a romantic aspect that is sort of taken off and taken hold. We even still have it. We have an example of it in current day where Westworld is built around this romantic notion of the Old West. And that's particularly interesting because there's something else going on there. I won't ruin it for anyone who hasn't watched it, but much like in real life, there was a lot more going on behind the scenes, and the romantic cowboys and Indians notion of it was relatively small. politics at the time are the reason this age has the name that it has. So the Gilded Age nickname was coined by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner because they thought that the era was covered in a layer of gold and that the glittering surface left little inside the core of the time. So what that means is they thought there was a lot of window dressing, essentially. There was a lot of money being thrown around, but not a lot of solid focus on sustainability or on the welfare of the people living within the country. Corruption in politics was at a supremely high level. It had always been relatively high, continues to be, but it was at a supremely high level during this time frame because there was so much money involved on every level. One of the most famous financial scandals was the Credit Mobilier. This was when corporate insiders from the Union Pacific Railroad oversaw the government project of building the railroad. Essentially, what that boils down to is they signed contracts with themselves and determined how much money would be given to themselves from the government in order to build these tracks. So they were essentially just writing themselves into money. The central politics at this point were hard to find. Things were pretty polarized, as you can imagine, following the Civil War, with Republicans ruling in the North and the Midwest. This meant a lot of Protestants and African Americans were fans of theirs. And the Democrats were known for ruling in the South. This was a lot of Catholics and Irish Americans as well. The Sherman Antitrust Act was put into being because of all of this combined. So trying to avoid corruption, trying to avoid this massive concentration of wealth, and trying to avoid this affecting politics the way that it did. So the Sherman Antitrust Act banned all combinations and practices that restrained free trade. The language was pretty vague, which made it less enforceable than it could have been. And it was to try to prevent monopolies from coming into existence. So it was to try to prevent one person from being able to own an entire industry, which, as we talked about before, didn't really happen. We had these robber barons or titans of industry who were in possession of a large amount of wealth and in charge of a large amount of the manufacturing processes within the United States. Governmental expansion was something that people were constantly questioning and still do, and it was expanding quite quickly at this time. In 1880, there were 100,000 employees of the federal government, and compared to today, there are about 2.5 million employees. During the Gilded Age, most were connected to big money, and that's how they obtained their position. So those in charge and those in the government were connected to big money and were connected to somebody who had big money, and that's how they got their position. The Civil Service Act of 1883 was put into place to address this and to provide a merit-based system through which people could climb through the ranks in their employment. They were trying to avoid this continuation of nepotism that had happened before, where people would just put people they liked or put their family members in the next position. At this point, the Civil Service Act demanded that you actually have the capability to do the job. In 1887, there was the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was established to ensure that railroads were charging fair rates for farmers and merchants. They sued the government was able to sue the railroad when things went wrong in order to protect the sellers. So if they were trading things from state to state or across the nation, which many of them were, they were able to be regulated under this. The gold standard was established in 1879, and this was the concept that paper currency could be exchanged for gold at a fixed rate at any time. So you're supposed to be able to back up the paper currency with metal. Political strife, as is often the case, was also quite rampant at this time. So President James A. Garfield was assassinated in 1881. He hadn't been in office for very long, just a few months, and he was shot in July and died from his wounds in September. The person who shot him, Charles Guiteau, believed that he was on a mission from God and was upset about the current political system and upset about not being able to obtain office. Chester Arthur took over the presidency at that point, and it was a strange time for people because they hadn't really gotten to know President Garfield that well. He hadn't been in office for very long, so they were sort of shocked at this assassination, but they had just lived through another assassination not long before with Lincoln, and they moved on under the leadership of Chester Arthur. There have been and always likely will be huge debates over the role of government in society and how much of one's life they should be able to know and control. Some of the things that they were looking to expand upon at this point were public health, welfare, and education. And these were all expanded in cities that were also working on creating parks and creating water and gas services. So they were looking to increase the availability of utilities to make cities function better. And they were also looking to increase parks to make cities look better and to increase people's moods within the cities, because there was a lot of unrest within the cities themselves. And the labor movement was part of this political strife as well, because it was also on the rise again due to social inequalities that were just rampant throughout the nation. And with this concentration of wealth at the top, the bottom parts of society, which were actually most people, began to rebel. People were in serious poverty situations, and more people than typically need to be. Of course, not that anybody needs to be in a situation of poverty, but it was quite pronounced during this era. The wealth gap was quite large. It's similar to the wealth gap that we now have. We'll talk about that later in the semester. And some of the social problems that go along with this are due to the new social order, which is one of broader public involvement in political issues. So the expansion of the vote to more and more people meant that more people were going to be involved and going to have a voice, theoretically. There was a great deal of labor unrest, people demanding more from their employers to compensate them fairly and provide safe working conditions to try to fend off that 35,000 per year killed. And the wealth gap grew enormously throughout this time, and this was part of the social problems at their root. The idea of economic independence really suffered at this time. So it was a very select few who were able to climb up to the top and sort of make it work for them without having to struggle at the bottom. Most people were struggling somewhere near the bottom. And in addition to these issues, throughout, there were ongoing issues of gender discrimination and racial discrimination. Oftentimes, these were exacerbated by this idea of social Darwinism. So in 1859, Charles Darwin, as I'm sure you're aware, famously published On the Origin of Species, his book about evolution. And shortly after, many of the concepts were co-opted in order to talk about social situations and hierarchies as being naturally derived and as a result of survival of the fittest. So regulation was said to be the antithesis of this evolutionary process because it was the government getting involved in a natural process of survival of the fittest within capitalism, rather than recognizing it as a rigged system in which very few were allowed to flourish based on the work of those at the bottom, which was the majority. Essentially, William Graham Sumner and other social Darwinists wrote essays and wrote books and gave lectures about it being the fault of the poor themselves and up to their heritage and that they were how they were. So part of this was hereditary, and part of this was just their fault for being lazy, essentially. And the people who rose to the top because it was their natural inclination, and certainly had nothing to do with them knowing the right people or being born into a situation of wealth. That was the opinion of social Darwinists. And I have a cartoon on the left here that, or on the right, excuse me, where Darwin is telling laissez-faire and eugenics, which we'll talk about coming up, to get out of his house. And this is not the original concept of survival of the fittest or natural selection that was explained in The Origin of Species. It was perverted into these notions to support greed and the continued wealth gap, essentially, at this time. The use of contracts helped those who established businesses to skirt their responsibility to their employee, and this became really popular during this time. The courts actually struck down laws that protected workers in favor of the freedom of the company and the signed contracts. So if an employee had to sign a contract in order to get a job that said that the employer was not responsible for certain things for them, they couldn't then come back and say that they were, because they'd already signed this paper saying that they knew that the employer was not responsible for these things. So if they were injured on the job, that was not on the employer, according to these contracts that they were signing. And the problem with this is that they couldn't get jobs without signing these contracts, and without a job, you didn't have food and you couldn't support your family. So people were forced into signing these contracts, and then the company was the only one who would benefit from them, essentially. One example is sweatshops were actually banned in Illinois briefly, but were reinstituted by the courts. The Sherman antitrust laws often didn't effectively prohibit monopolies, and instead oftentimes went against the workers and their strikes. So the courts were often on the side of big business because money was tied up so heavily into politics and within the courts that they were willing to rule in favor of keeping their position as it was and not getting on the bad side of these businesses and business owners. 1877 was the year that we talked about with the end of Reconstruction. This was the bargain of 1877 that led to the evacuation of troops from the southern states. And this was also the same year of the Great Railroad Strike. There was a multi-state strike protesting low pay, which held up railroad traffic. And as we've been talking about, railroad traffic meant that goods were moving from one place to another. So much of the economy was depending on railroads moving smoothly at this point. Eventually, a militia was sent in, and 20 people were killed in Pittsburgh, after which other protesters burned down the station and burned down tracks. There were general strikes in conjunction with this in Chicago and St. Louis. And following the incident where people were killed, armories were built in major cities in order to be ready to respond to rebellions like this in the future. What many of them were protesting for was this idea of 8 hours for what we will. That's what they call it. So there's 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, and 8 hours for what they will. So either taking care of their own homes, or eventually, if they were able to, having some leisure time. The Haymarket Affair is another example of massive unrest. So in May Day, which is May 1st, 1886, there were 350,000 workers out protesting across the nation for this 8-hour workday. And A few days later, on May 3rd, in Chicago, police killed 4 of the strikers who were out there. And the next day, there was a large demonstration against those murders. An unknown person threw a bomb into the crowd and killed a police officer. There were 8 anarchists who were arrested, even though there was little to no evidence against them. They were convicted anyway. 4 of the men were hanged, 1 committed suicide, and the other 3 were released from detainment after a few years. It is notable that 7 out of the 8 convicted men were foreign-born. And there was serious concern about new immigrants coming to the United States at this time. People were worried that their newly reestablished white U.S. culture was going to be tainted by people who didn't understand it and who hadn't been through the Civil War and who hadn't understood what it was like before. So as had been the case for many years, people were afraid of new outsiders coming in. The entire Haymarket affair was used to scare employees into doing what companies asked from them at that point forward. It also served as a rallying cry on the other side of things for some to seek justice. So the question is, what did the people want? Many workers became interested in bridging the wealth gap. There were many books that were published at the time that looked into the ways it could be fixed for the future. And there were dystopian and utopian readings that were available to encourage people to act. Utopian means that they figured out this way to make everybody happy and live in peace and harmony. And dystopian is they didn't figure it out and it got worse in the future. Socialism is a concept that came up during this time that many people were interested in, many people were against. But the definition of socialism that we have is private control of economic enterprises should be replaced by government ownership in order to ensure fairer distribution of benefits of the wealth produced. So this is essentially saying there should be government-run businesses and agencies rather than private control over everything. So this is to say healthcare, for example, is something you're going to hear a lot about in the next election. And some people would be arguing for government control of healthcare in that they believe it would provide fairer distribution and keep the costs in line with what people can afford. There's obviously a lot you could read about socialism. You could read about the history of socialism. You could read about the different iterations of socialism, because certainly there are different iterations. Karl Marx suggested that it would need to begin with violence, which is not the case for all socialist countries. You could see certainly Germany has experienced violence, but you could look at Sweden, you could look at Canada, and these are examples of socialist countries that have major governmental agencies providing some of the basics. You can also look to particular policies, so Medicare and Medicaid and unemployment insurance. A lot of those sorts of things are actually socialist programs. It means they come out of our taxes and then they're distributed out to others who need them. And moral reform at this point, which is an ever-changing term, was popular within what became known as the Bible Belt. So this state that sort of this set of states that sort of serves as a belt through the country. The biblical note on these reforms was what stood out and continues to actually influence that same region today. So this is the start of what we now know as the Bible Belt. And the social gospel was a popular concept at this point, and it refers to the freedom and the spiritual development that required equalization of wealth and power. And there were missions and relief programs set up for this, for the urban poor throughout the nation. So these are some of the things that people were looking for and that they wanted at this point. And you'll be able to read about some of these concepts in your Voices of Freedom book, because you'll read William Graham Sumner on social Darwinism, so you'll see a little bit of what he had to say about it. You'll read a Second Declaration of Independence and Edward Bellamy Looking Backward, a little bit of that. You're obviously free to read the other ones in your Voices of Freedom book as well, but those are the ones that you'll be assigned to read that go along with this chapter. And next week, we will be moving forward and we'll start to talk about American imperialism. We'll start to talk about the Progressive Era as well. So keep all of this in mind as we're moving forward, and we'll keep referencing what we've learned so that we know that we're building on this as we're moving forward. And you can see how all of these things